Welcome to the Beach House 34 podcast, where we dive deep into stories of true crime and the unexplained. It's July 10th, 1981, in Skidmore, Missouri, a town so small you could drive through it in less than a minute. On this Friday morning, Main Street is lined with dusty pickups, and the sun is already pretty high. But this warm July day doesn't seem to bother the nearly 40 people standing outside of the D&G Tavern. There's a reason they've gathered there. Some are just watching, others are talking amongst themselves. But no matter what anyone is doing, there's a full-on tension in the air that all of them are feeling. And then a man steps out of the bar. His wife trails behind him. This man is over 6 feet tall. He's nearly 300 pounds. He's intimidating, for sure, but it's not only his appearance, it's his reputation that makes him this way. This man, his name is Ken Rex McElroy, and this name is enough to make people lock their doors at night, even in this small, once wholesome town. He climbs into his pickup, he lights a cigarette, and he takes a sip of beer. He doesn't seem to be bothered by the vast amounts of people surrounding his vehicle. For a moment, everything is quiet and still. And then, without warning, gunfire. The man who had just settled behind the wheel of his pickup truck slumps forward, blood pooling in his seat. In broad daylight, with nearly 4 dozen witnesses standing just feet away, Ken Rex McElroy is shot dead. And yet, when the smoke clears, nobody claims to have seen a thing. This isn't just a story about murder. It's about fear. It's about power. And it's about what happens when justice fails so many times that people decide to just take it into their own hands. Ken McElroy, he was no ordinary man. He was Skidmore's tormentor, a figure who, for decades, intimidated witnesses, beat the justice system, and terrorized this small community who ended up too scared to speak up. He was accused of everything. He was indicted 21 times, but never convicted. But on this day, someone, or maybe several someones, had had enough. As Ken sat in his truck, he was shot at close range by bullets from at least 2 different firearms. Ken was referred to as the town bully, and newspapers would later call what happened that day vigilante justice. But what really happened in Skidmore, and why, after all these years, has no one ever been held accountable? So as we talk about this story, let me ask you, and really, really sit with this one. If the system fails again and again, if the courts don't protect you, if the man terrorizing your town is still walking free, is it still murder when someone finally pulls the trigger? Or is it something else? Today, we're going to go into the heart of Skidmore, a place that was forever changed by this single moment of violence and the silence that has lasted for more than 40 years. But to understand what happened in Skidmore, you have to start with the man at the center of it all, Ken Rex McElroy. Ken was born on June 1st, 1934, in Overland Park, Kansas, and he was the 15th of 16 children in a poor family of migrant tenant farmers. His parents moved the family back and forth between Kansas and the Ozarks before finally settling outside of Skidmore, Missouri, when Ken was still a young boy. Life was challenging, and there really wasn't much supervision for any of these kids. By the time that Ken dropped out of school at age 15, having completed only the eighth grade, he was already known around town for his size, his temper, and his willingness to bend the rules. A former classmate would later recall he was bullying people in school. He was about a foot taller than everyone else because he got held back so much. I'm not sure if he could even read. Even as a teenager, Ken was already getting into trouble with small thefts, driving without a license, and run ins with the law that often only ended up with a slap on the wrist. What started as petty mischief soon escalated into something much darker. By his late teens and early 20s, he had built a reputation not just as a troublemaker, but as a man to be feared. He learned to navigate the back roads of Nottoway County, putting those skills to use by rustling hogs and cattle, burglarizing barns, stealing grain, and intimidating anyone who tried to stand in his way. He could really be charming when he wanted to be. He had jet black hair, these striking eyes, and just really had a knack for using words that could either win people over or put them on edge just as easily. One resident remembered there were a lot of people who lived in fear because he would agitate them at all hours of the day and night. He was a man who seemed to always carry a gun. He flashed a lot of money around and threatened just about anyone in sight. Ken's intimidation, it wasn't just physical, it was also psychological. He would follow people home. He would sit outside their houses for hours and made sure that everyone knew he was watching. Sometimes he would even fire his gun into the air. Other times he would just simply let people see that, yeah, hey, I'm armed. In everyday life, the townspeople said that he would sometimes travel with his wife, Trina, in one pickup truck behind him, and even a third vehicle at times, believed to be backup vehicles, just adding to this intimidation factor. The message was always the same. You don't cross Ken Rex McElroy. Over the course of his life, Ken was accused of dozens of felonies. This included assault, child abduction, statutory rape, arson, animal cruelty, hog and cattle rustling, burglary, and more. He was indicted at least 21 times, but somehow he was never held accountable. Charges were dropped, cases were dismissed, and witnesses either recanted or refused to testify. And the reason? Fear. Witnesses who attempted to stand up to Ken often found themselves being followed, threatened, or worse. There are accounts of individuals waking up to discover their barns had been burned down, their pets had been killed, or even Ken himself sitting in his truck outside of their homes with a shotgun visible in the window. When it came to his legal strategy, he was just as ruthless. He had hired a skilled defense attorney named Richard Gene McFadden, who knew how to delay trials, challenge evidence, and exploit every legal loophole. However, the real power lay in Ken's ability to silence potential witnesses through intimidation, threats, and outright violence. And each time his attorney secured an extension, it simply gave Ken more time to intimidate those who might testify against him. And consider, too, that Skidmore had far fewer than 500 residents. It didn't have a full-time police force, and people could go days, maybe even weeks, without even seeing a patrol car. The most it may have had was a part-time city marshal, if that. If folks wanted help, the closest law enforcement was the Nottoway County Sheriff's Office, who was 15 miles away in Maryville. This gap between the town and the people meant to protect it wasn't just geographic, it was emotional. Because by the time that deputies showed up, the damage was often already done. And for people in Skidmore, it began to feel like help wasn't just far away, it might never come at all. The list of charges and accusations against Ken reads like a criminal's resume. He had statutory charges in 1955 and 1964. Both of these were dismissed when the young victims refused to testify. He had assault with intent to do great bodily harm in the 1968 beating of Glen Graham and his daughter, Anita Foster, and charges were dropped after polygraphs were conflicting. There are multiple counts of child rape and arson in the 1970s, including the notorious case of his eventual wife, Trina. She was just 12 when he began to pursue her, and at 14, she became pregnant. And at 17, Ken married her in a legal move that prevented her from testifying against him in court. And the list goes on and on. But the breaking point was the 1980 shooting of a 70-year-old grocer named Bowencamp, which finally led to Ken's only conviction of second-degree assault. By the early 1980s, the town of Skidmore was just not dealing with a bully. It was living in fear of a man who just seemed untouchable. The law couldn't or wouldn't stop him, and the community's trust in the justice system had been shattered. They had been intimidated by him for years, and no one seemed capable of helping them. On June 13th of 1968, Glen Graham, 52, and his daughter, Anita Foster, were checking on horses in a rented pasture when Ken McElroy and 3 other men appeared. What followed was a brutal assault. Glen was beaten with brass knuckles, kicked in the head and face, and struck with a club. The attack was so vicious that his left eye was torn from its socket and required stitching to repair. Anita, she tried to help her dad, but she too was attacked. She was choked, punched, and threatened with death if she ever went to the police. Despite the severity of their injuries and their willingness to testify, the justice system kind of fell through. Polygraph tests produced conflicting results. Some showed that Glen and his daughter were being truthful, and some showed that the defendants were as well. So prosecutors who were faced with this ambiguity dropped the charges against Ken and the 2 others. Even then, the message to Skidmore was clear. If you stood up to Ken, you risked not only just violence, but the possibility that nothing would be done about it. A few years later, Ken's pattern of predatory behavior escalated. He began to pursue Trina. She was just 12 years old. He was 35. By the time Trina was 14, she was pregnant. And she was now living in Ken's house with his then wife, Alice. When Trina and Alice decided to leave the home, they headed to Trina's parents for safety. But Ken, he tracked them down. When he knew that Trina's parents weren't at home, he then decided to burn down their house and shoot their dog. Trina was then hospitalized for injuries from his abuse, and Trina and her baby were put in foster care. But they wouldn't be safe for very long because Ken then stalked the foster home, threatened the family that took her in, and made it clear that he knew where their own daughter went to school. Now, eventually, Trina ran away from foster care and returned to Ken. So, what Ken did is he divorced Alice and married Trina. This was a legal move, more so to prevent Trina from testifying against him. Because at the time, Missouri law didn't allow a wife to be compelled to testify against her husband. So, as a result, these charges that were against Ken for this statutory for arson and assault involving Trina, his now wife, they were all dropped. By the summer of 1976, the violence had become more public. On July 26th, farmer Romaine Henry had heard gunshots on his property, which was near Graham, Missouri. He got into his pickup to investigate, and he found Ken's truck parked in one of his fields. Henry would later testify that Ken approached him and accused him of driving past his house in a white Pontiac and called him a liar. Quote, "The next thing I knew, I was looking at the barrel of a shotgun." Ken fired, and this first blast from this 12-gauge shotgun hit Henry in the stomach. A second shot grazed his head as he ducked. Bleeding and disoriented, he managed to drive himself home, where his wife then rushed him to the hospital. A warrant was issued for Ken, but he disappeared for a time before he actually finally turned himself in. But at trial, Henry testified to the entire confrontation, but Ken's defense produced two carpenters who claimed that Ken was with them during the time of the shooting. And despite clear medical evidence and Henry's unwavering testimony, Ken was acquitted. For the people of Skidmore, it was just another bitter lesson. Even when someone nearly died, the system could not or would not stop Ken McElroy. By now, Skidmore was living in fear. Ken's tactics of intimidation were relentless. He would drive slowly through town with this rifle visible in his truck. He would park outside homes late at night with the engine idling, sometimes fire his gun into the air. Witnesses to his crimes were often too frightened to testify, and those who did found themselves either stalked or threatened. Quote, "There were a lot of people who lived in fear because he would agitate them at all hours of the day and night." And another person said he was a man who seemed to always carry a gun, flashed a lot of money around, and threatened just about anyone in sight. By 1980, the town's patience was wearing very, very thin. The final straw actually came about over a piece of candy. One of Ken's young daughters was accused of stealing candy from the Bowencamp family grocery store, and the clerk who was working there, Evelyn Sumner, simply asked the little girl to put it back. And for most people, this would have been the end of it. But not for Ken. Ken's wife, Trina, returned to the store and accused this clerk of stealing from their daughter, and the situation escalated. Ken then began stalking the Bowencamp family. He would park outside their house and he would make threats. Then one day, while 70-year-old Bo Bowencamp was unloading goods behind the store, Ken shot him in the neck with a rifle. Miraculously, he survived. Now, at this point, Ken was charged with attempted murder, but in court, Trina provided an alibi, and a jury ultimately convicted him of only second-degree assault. He was sentenced to 2 years. 2 years. But instead of going to prison, he was released on a $40,000 bond while his appeal was pending. By the time the summer of 1981 rolled around, Skidmore was a town on a razor-thin edge. The shooting of Bowencamp, this very well-liked elderly grocer, had shattered any illusion of safety that even remained. And now that Ken had been released on bond, he was free and clear to harass the Bowencamp family. For weeks after this attack, Bo and his wife Lois endured relentless harassment. They would get threatening phone calls. Ken would sit outside their house and even fire his gun into the air in the middle of the night. Lois reported these to the police, but the only advice that she received was to keep an eye on Ken. So Bo's wife Lois later said, quote, "Same old story. Police arrest him, courts let him go." She and a neighbor began taking turns sleeping. One would stay awake to keep watch at night. That's how frightened they were. The message was incredibly clear. The law could not or would not protect them. Ken even continued his threats against the Bowencamp family by showing up at the D&G Tavern with an M1 Garand rifle and a bayonet, threatening to finish what he'd started. For Skidmore, the people of Skidmore, that was the line. The town had endured more than a decade of violence, intimidation, and failed justice. People just stopped calling the police. They stopped believing that the courts could protect them. And instead, they watched and waited, trapped in this cycle of fear and silence. The law had failed them, and the only thing left was each other and the hope that somehow this nightmare named Ken would end. The effect that this one man had on this small town was chilling. Every time Ken showed up in town, people emptied the streets, they locked their doors. Quote, everyone was so uncomfortable and scared. Even law enforcement officers felt his wrath. A state trooper, Richard Stratton, who had arrested Ken for the Bowencamp shooting in the first place, found Ken stalking his own home and once pointing a shotgun at his wife. If the police themselves were afraid, what chance did ordinary citizens have? The final straw came on July 10th of 1981. That morning, about 60 Skidmore residents gathered at the American Legion Hall, and the purpose was clear. They wanted to know how they could legally protect themselves from Ken Rex McElroy. Nottoway County Sheriff Dan Estes, he was present, but his advice kind of felt hollow. He told them to avoid direct confrontation and consider forming a neighborhood watch. For a town that had watched the law fail again and again, this was not enough. As this meeting continued, someone came in and said that Ken and his wife Trina were currently at the D&G Tavern. So part of this group left the Legion Hall and walked to the tavern. Inside the tavern, Ken sat at the bar, drinking a beer and acting as if nothing could touch him. He finished his drink, he bought a six-pack to go, and he walked outside to his truck. Trina joined him in the passenger seat. What happened next would become one of the most infamous moments in American history. As Ken sat in his truck, surrounded by a crowd of 30 to 60 people, shots rang out. Ken was struck in the head and the neck by bullets from at least 2 different firearms. He died instantly. Trina, covered in blood, scrambled out of the truck screaming. The rear window of the truck had been blown out and the front windshield was shattered. And Ken, slumped over the wheel, was dead. Trina, on the other hand, was left unharmed, at least physically. Despite the crowd, no one called for help. No one rendered aid. When law enforcement finally arrived, not one person in the crowd claimed to have seen who fired the shots. Quote, "I didn't see anything. I don't know what happened." This was the same statement repeated over and over to police and investigators. This silence was absolute. It was a wall that had been built from years of fear, frustration, and this collective sense that justice had finally been served. Trina identified a local man as the shooter, but investigators found that the trajectory of the bullets kind of contradicted her account. The shots, they determined, came from a different direction than she was describing, and ballistics revealed bullets from at least two guns, but no single weapon or shooter could be definitively linked to the crime. It didn't take long for law enforcement to descend on the scene. The killing had happened in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses, but the investigation would quickly reveal just how deeply the town's silence ran. After this happened, the story of Skidmore's breaking point captured national attention. Reporters flocked to the town. This term vigilante justice became synonymous with Ken McElroy's name. But for the people who had lived under his shadow, it was less about vengeance and more about survival. As one resident put it, "We've had enough. Before this happened, Ken used to drive through the town at night. He would terrorize us all. Now we can go to bed and sleep." The killing of Ken McElroy was just not the end of a man. It was kind of the end of an era of fear. But it also left behind this legacy of unanswered questions. What happens to a community when the law cannot or will not protect its own? Deputies from the Nottoway County Sheriff's Department, along with a task force of 23 officers from 6 law enforcement agencies, began to process the crime scene. They collected spent shell casings and bullet fragments from around Ken's truck and in the street. The autopsy would later confirm that Ken had been struck by at least 2 bullets. One was from a .22 caliber weapon and another was from an 8mm rifle. Investigators immediately began to interview those who were present, and they compiled a list of 35 people who were at the scene. But no one would talk. Quote, "We had 35 leads, and 35 leads saw nothing and heard nothing," said Gary Howard, a Missouri sheriff. A hotline was set up for anonymous tips, but the only calls came from reporters. Within days, this task force turned over its evidence to Nottoway County prosecutor David Baird. On July 21st, a coroner's inquest was held with a 6-person jury of county residents. Jurors heard evidence from law enforcement, from Trina McElroy, Ken's wife, and several men who had been at the scene, including the postmaster, the mayor, and a bartender from the D&G Tavern. Trina, Ken's wife, and was the only person in the truck with him, and she told authorities and the coroner's jury that she saw Del Clement, a local farmer and the son of the D&G Tavern's co-owner, retrieve a rifle from his truck and shoot her husband. She repeated this identification before both grand juries that would convene in the coming months. However, no other witness corroborated her account. This wall of silence held. The first grand jury, which was convened by the county, ruled that Ken had died from bullets fired by a person or persons unknown. There was insufficient evidence to issue an arrest warrant for anyone. 3 weeks later, a state grand jury was impaneled and met for 15 sessions over 5 weeks. Jurors heard from the same witnesses, including Del Clement, Sheriff Dan Estes, Romaine Henry, the guy who was beaten along with his daughter, and Bowencamp. And again, Trina named Clement as the shooter. But without supporting testimony or any physical evidence that could tie him to the crime beyond this reasonable doubt, The grand jury ended its investigation with no indictments. But the investigation didn't even stop there. The U.S. Justice Department ordered an FBI probe into whether Ken's civil rights had been violated. Agents re interviewed witnesses, and in the spring of 1982, a federal grand jury heard testimony. In September, the federal investigation concluded without anyone being indicted. The FBI announced that it had turned over, quote, important new evidence to the local prosecutor. But after looking at this evidence, David Baird, the prosecutor, stated there is not current sufficient evidence with which to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In all, more than 100 people were interviewed. 2 grand juries, a coroner's inquest, and a federal investigation all ended up with the same conclusion. No one would be charged. The silence that had protected Ken for decades now protected his killer or killers. The case remains officially unsolved, and the town's secret, who killed Ken Rex McElroy, remains unspoken to this day. It remains one of America's most brazen unsolved crimes, not because the evidence is lacking, but because the silence of the residents of Skidmore has held firm for over 4 decades. So while Clement denied involvement, some of the townspeople privately thought that he was one of the triggermen. And the reason for this is that he was motivated by Ken's harassment of his family. This fueled rumors of this coordinated effort. If several people fired at the same time, no individual could be blamed. One resident later claimed, quote, they planned it so everyone could say they didn't see a thing. The coroner's jury ruled that Ken died, quote, by a felony act committed by person or persons unknown. And this is a phrase that kind of underscores the town's collective ambiguity. For many, the killing was less about vengeance than survival. Ken's decades of intimidation had eroded trust in the legal system. As one local put it, the law couldn't stop him, so someone else had to. The town of Skidmore and its refusal to cooperate became its defining trait. When investigators did press residents, one of them said, why are you here now? Where were you when we needed help? So what about Trina? Trina, remember, was his victim. Yet years later, she defended him however she could. How could this possibly happen? Her story is deeply disturbing. It just shows a pattern of Ken first grooming her when she was all of 12. And by the time she was 14, she was pregnant and then eventually moved in with Ken and Ken's then wife, Alice. Ken either built trust or more likely fear in Trina in order to gain control of her, which means that Trina had very little sense of self. While she was this kid, she was still figuring things out. She was taken advantage of at this point in her life in the most brutal way possible. When Alice decided to take Trina away from Ken and headed back to Trina's own family home, Ken stalked them. He found them. He brought them back. And when Trina's parents were away, then killed her dog and burned down her house. When she was put in foster care, he stalked the foster family and threatened the family's own daughter. And eventually Trina ran away, but she ran away back to Ken. Because of her age, and because there was still a case pending for Ken regarding Trina's assault, he decided to then divorce Alice and marry Trina, even though she was still a minor. She was 17 years old, because he knew that the law wouldn't allow a wife to testify against their husband. It was all about power and control with Ken. When Ken was murdered in 1981, Trina was in her early 20s. But her entire adolescence and early adult life had been shaped by this one man. Her world was so small, she couldn't see any other way out. After Ken died, Trina began to negotiate the sale of movie rights to his whole story, and even said publicly that she planned to use $5,000 of the future proceeds to establish a reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of whoever it was that had killed her husband. On July 9th of 1984, she then filed a $5 million wrongful death lawsuit against the town of Skidmore. Not only the town, but Nottoway County, Sheriff Dan Estes, Mayor Steve Peters, and Del Clement, who she believed was the shooter. This was settled out of court by everyone involved for $17,600, with no one admitting guilt. Trina did eventually remarry in 1983, so not too long after she lost Ken, and ended up moving to Lebanon, Missouri. She passed away from cancer on her 55th birthday in January of 2012. The legacy of Skidmore's silence, it's really complicated. On one hand, the town found a way to end its nightmare when the law would not. On the other hand, the unanswered questions and lack of accountability have kind of left this void. Was it justice or simply the only way out for a desperate town? Did the town find peace, or did it end up trading one kind of trauma for another? As you think about this story, consider what it means for a community, especially a very small, tight-knit community, to be pushed to its breaking point by one person. If you were a resident of Skidmore, what would you have done? There is this definitive book on the case of Ken Rex McElroy, and it's called In Broad Daylight, A Murder in Skidmore, Missouri by Harry McLean. He is a lawyer and a journalist and spent years investigating this case, even living near Skidmore to gain the trust of its residents. If you're interested in this, I will have a link to the book in the description. There was also a 6-part true crime documentary series released in 2019 called No One Saw a Thing that you may be interested in if you want to hear more about this story. Before we wrap this up, I wanted to bring to your attention something that caught my attention. And in 1981, the Columbia Daily Tribune newspaper posted a photo of Red Smith, who was a bartender for the D&G Tavern. And he's got a very wide smile on his face as he stands there holding 2 postcards. One of these postcards is from Alaska, and another one is from Chicago. So what was so important about these postcards? Well, both of them were postcards congratulating the people of Skidmore for doing what they did. Thank you, thank you, thank you all so much, you beautiful people. If you have a moment, check out my Patreon, where you get access to perks like ad-free videos and ones that are uncensored. If this isn't your thing, you don't want to spend any money, that's totally okay. You can still support the channel by just clicking the subscribe button, especially on YouTube. It doesn't cost anything, and it helps the channel grow to bring you more content. Thank you all so much again. We'll talk real soon. Bye for now.